Sleep is a new psychological horror film that is brought to you by Mike Flanagan. Mike Flanagan is the man that brought you Oculus and The Haunting of Hill House on Netflix. This is a film that is 30 to 40 years in the making. It is a direct sequel to The Shining, which is a Stephen King adaptation that was turned into a movie by Stanley Kubrick. While there also is a book called Dr. Sleep, this movie functions as a direct sequel to The Shining and to the source material started by Stephen King. This film stars Ewan McGregor, Cliff Curtis, Rebecca Ferguson, and this movie takes place, like I said, present day, 30 to 40 years after the events of The Shining. In this movie, little Danny Torrance has now become an adult, played by Ewan McGregor, and he's struggling with some things. He develops a strange connection to a little girl who also has The Shining, and because of their connection, and a lot of it because of this little girl, it attracts the attention of Rebecca Ferguson and a group of people that she's leading. And so what we have here is a psychological and spiritual and physical battle between Rebecca Ferguson and her people, and some of the people who carry with them The Shining, and that's really all I want to get into without spoilers. The Shining is one of my favorite horror films of all time. I love that movie. I love everything about it. I would probably say I'm more of a casual horror fan nowadays. There's nothing casual about my love for The Shining. But I'm also one of those people that has read the Stephen King adaptation, and so I do understand that Stephen King wasn't happy with that movie because there were some deviations and there were some changes from the source material to fit it on screen. I walked into this movie excited but also anxious because my fanboy brain was like at war with itself and it was fighting over what I wanted this movie to be. Now, on one hand, I wanted the movie to honor The Shining because The Shining is such an iconic film, and I feel like it should go in and try to pay homage to The Shining in a lot of ways that makes fans happy. But at the same time, I wanted this movie to incorporate more of the elements that were from the book that made the book such a great thing, and I want that so that Stephen King can stop bitching about it. At the same time, I think this movie needed to be its own thing, and not overly rely on the crux of, hey, you remember this from The Shining? Hey, you know this from the books? Surprisingly, I would say that this movie gets a solid B+ to A- on all of those fronts. I think it did a really good job at honoring the legacy of both the books and The Shining while also standing on its own 2 feet. I think if you're a fan of the books and of Stephen King's work, then I think you're going to love some of the little ways that they pay homage, some of the little ways that they incorporate those elements into this story. So many callbacks and references, both visually and narrative, to The Shining. It's hard to avoid them. Some would argue that that's fan service, and I would say, yeah, okay, they might have a point. To me, fan service doesn't really bother me as long as it's in service of the story and the characters, as long as it doesn't detract from that. And I would say the fan service in this movie is fan service that is done the right way because it adds to the characters, it adds to the narrative. It's not just fan service thrown in there for no reason. But visually speaking, if you love The Shining and you love some of the iconic scenes that were created in that movie, this movie definitely has a passion for those scenes, and it definitely shows that on screen. You can tell that Mike Flanagan is a big fan of Stephen King and of The Shining in general, and a lot of that shines through with his work here, especially behind the camera. One of the things that makes this movie stand out from being your stereotypical horror movie is that Mike Flanagan as a director is not really interested in all the stereotypical tropes that come with that genre. This is a man that definitely uses the cinematography, the visuals, the lighting, the coloring to add to the suspension and the tension of the psychological drama at play. It's similar to The Haunting of Hill House on Netflix, where it's not really about the spirits and the external threats that these kids and these characters were experiencing. It's really more about the internal demons and the psychological things that these characters are dealing with and how that can manifest itself in a horror movie like this. Character work in this movie is so much stronger because of it, because this movie takes the time to build these characters up so that when shit does get real later on in the movie, you actually feel something for them. It helps that the performances are all tremendous in this movie. Ewan McGregor is such a great older Danny Torrance. He did a good job at portraying the kind of demons that can haunt a man 30 to 40 years after all the traumatic events that took place in that movie. I would also say that the surprise of the movie came from a little girl. I think her name's Kylie Curran. I don't know if I've seen her in anything else, and obviously she's a kid actor. Sometimes you go into a movie like this and you're like, oh my god, a kid actor. Well, I hope she doesn't mess it up. You're not thinking that while you're watching her in this movie. You're thinking, holy fucking shit, she's awesome. I love her performance. I love this character. She was in the movie a lot more than I thought she was going to be, and she really added a lot to this film. I think the person that stole the show for me, though, was Rebecca Ferguson. This might be my favorite villain performance of 2019. Definitely had the kind of intimidation factor and the menace and that creep factor that you like to see in a villain. At the same time, just like the other characters in the movie, the groundwork is laid for you to understand where Rebecca Ferguson's character is coming from. Obviously, this is a very gorgeous and well-shot film. Mike Flanagan loves those single-shot, long takes, and there's obviously more than a few of those type of shots, but Mike Flanagan just knows how to elevate the material, elevate what he's doing on screen with his camera angles, with his shot placement, with his composition. The thing that really added to the atmosphere and the tension of this movie was the musical score. They did a great job at incorporating some of the musical cues from The Shining, put it into this movie, but they didn't allow that to override the other musical cues in the movie, which are very daunting, very bleak, very dark, you know, the kind of musical score that's very intense and gets you into the moment. I will say this, though, I don't think that this movie is necessarily scary. I have to say that before I get into the flaws of this movie, because I feel like that's going to be be a sticking point for some people. Personally, I don't really get that scared by movies anymore, so I kind of look for more in a horror movie anyways. Like, I look more into the presentation, into the experience of the whole thing. For people that need to be scared, this is not your movie. This movie, I would say, is not really all that scary. There's some creepy imagery. I have a hard time seeing how anybody could walk out of this movie and go, holy shit, I was terrified. It's gonna turn some people off, as well as the slow pace of the movie. I will admit that in the first 20 to 30 minutes of the movie, pacing is a little bit off, but I do think that Mike could have cut some of his scenes a little bit shorter together and made things flow a little bit faster. It does take a while before things start popping off and happening in this movie. I would say another issue for me is, visually speaking, the movie tries something that I can't spoil, but it's one of those things where it's visually very jarring to watch if you're watching it the first time. There's a practicality to it that I appreciated, but it's also one of those things where when you see it, you'll see it, and it's kind of one of those, I don't know if it really landed for what they were going for. I would also say that the third act of this movie gets a little bit too cliche, generic action horror movie trope. Turns into that kind of movie for a while, and that was kind of disappointing because for the first 2 hours, it's really more of a psychological slow burn. I'll compare it to The Winter Soldier. The Winter Soldier is a great film. I love The Winter Soldier. The first 2 acts of The Winter Soldier are really more of like a political thriller that happens to have a superhero in it. You get to the third act of the movie and all hell breaks loose, and it's pretty much your standard issue comic book shit. I mean, it's a world-ending thing. It's kind of what the third act of this movie was, and that's kind of why I wasn't feeling it as much once we got into that section of the movie. You can tell that this movie is going to be a little bit divisive among fans, especially people who want something that's a little bit more scary or something that moves a little bit faster. Dr. Sleep was a worthwhile follow-up to The Shining and a great adaptation of Stephen King's work, and I'm going to give this one Superman Prime. Is it better than The Shining? No, it's not better than The Shining in my opinion, and it never was going to be, and I feel like if you go into this movie with that mentality, you're going to end up doing more harm to yourself than good. It's kind of like dating Serena Williams and then going on and getting a new girlfriend. I mean, yeah, your new girlfriend's probably going to be hot or whatever, but she's not going to be Serena fucking Williams. Unless your girlfriend is also thick as hell while being able to hit 2 balls across the net, but I don't know, I just kind of doubt that's the case. Give me your top 5. Give me your top 5 favorite horror films of all time in the comment section below. Stay tuned for more videos. I got a lot of content coming out the next couple of days. Please give me a like, give me a subscribe to the channel. I'd really appreciate it. If you like what you see, tell me how you feel, and stay tuned to hear more from the Man of Steel. Peace.